I spent 5 years being the invisible bank for this family. It took my mother exactly 9 words over a roasted turkey to close the account forever. We were gathered around the oak dining table for Thanksgiving. My 9-year-old adopted son Leo had been placed in the hallway on a folding chair because my mother claimed we were short on space. He stood up to grab a napkin just as my mother poured her wine, leaned toward my sister and said, loud enough for the room to hear, "He is not really ours, let us be honest. We should not have to pretend on a holiday." My mother did not realize Leo was standing right in the doorway. I watched his face fall. I watched the realization hit a child who had done nothing but try to belong. I stood up slowly. I walked over and took my son's hand. I looked directly at my mother and said the one sentence that made my father drop his fork. "Since we are being honest." Then I tossed a heavy leather portfolio onto the center of the table, knocking over her crystal wine glass. Welcome back to QT Told Stories. If you have ever watched a family single out a child while the rest of the room stays quiet, you already know the heat in your chest right now. Drop a comment, tell me how old you are and where you are listening from, and make sure you subscribe. Because what happens at this table changes everything. The countdown to that dinner started 3 weeks earlier. My name is Bella Leach. I am 34 years old, and I run supply chain logistics for an auto parts manufacturer here in Indiana. In our town, you are defined by 2 things: racing culture and high school basketball. The annual tip-off game in early November is a required community event. My mother, Diane, decided the Leach family needed to make an impression in the bleachers this year. She announced she was ordering custom matching jerseys for everyone. The box arrived on a Sunday afternoon while we were all gathered at the Legacy Farm. My dad, Richard, was tinkering in the garage. My sister, Natalie, and her husband, Brent, were on the porch with their biological twins, Mason and Harper. My mother opened the cardboard box on the kitchen island like she was unveiling a monument. She handed the first 2 to the twins, then one for Natalie, one for Brent, one for my dad, one for herself, and one for me. My son Leo stood at the edge of the island. He is a quiet kid who loves scale model cars and keeping his head down, but he loves basketball. He had been asking about the jerseys all week. He waited with his hands in his pockets. My mother flattened the empty cardboard box and set it aside. Leo looked at the counter. Then he looked at my mother. "Did mine not come yet, Grandma?" My mother gave a tight little sigh, the kind you give when a waiter brings the wrong side dish. "Oh, sweetie, there must have been a shipping error. I am sure it is on the way." She turned her back and started talking to Natalie about seating arrangements. Leo looked down at his sneakers. He nodded and walked out to the front porch. I did not yell. In my line of work, you do not react to a missing shipment by screaming. You check the invoice. After my mother went to the living room, I walked over to the recycling bin. I pulled out the packing slip she had tossed inside. The order was itemized. 7 custom jerseys, 7 names printed clearly on the receipt: Diane, Richard, Natalie, Brent, Mason, Harper, Bella. Leo was never on the order. She had planned the exclusion down to the keystroke. I folded the receipt and put it in my pocket. I did not confront her. Arguing with my mother is a game designed to make you look unhinged while she plays the victim. I walked out to the porch, sat next to my son, and watched the wind blow across the fields. The storm was coming. I just needed to gather the paperwork. We drove back to our house in silence that Sunday afternoon. Leo sat in the passenger seat of my car and watched the barren Indiana cornfields blur past the window. He did not cry. He just kept his hands folded in his lap. I kept my eyes on the highway. In supply chain logistics, you learn very quickly that reacting with emotion is a liability. When a shipment fails, you do not yell at the empty loading dock. You trace the failure back to its origin. You identify the weak point in the system. I knew exactly what my mother was doing with those custom basketball jerseys. She was establishing a hierarchy. She was drawing a line in the sand to show my son he was an outsider. But she was drawing that line on a foundation she did not even own. To understand the architecture of this family, we have to rewind 5 years. My father ran a small manufacturing firm on the edge of town. He produced specialized silicone gaskets for the local racing teams. He was a brilliant mechanic, but a terrible accountant. When the business finally folded under the weight of bad contracts, the debt swallowed everything they had. The bank posted a bright yellow foreclosure notice on the front door of the Leach Legacy Farm. That farm was 50 acres of prime Midwestern soil. It was the house my grandfather built. My parents were exactly 6 weeks away from eviction and public ruin. I sat in a sterile attorney office in downtown Indianapolis that October. The room smelled of lemon polish and stale coffee. I signed a cashier check for $400,000. I liquidated my early corporate stock options to do it. But I did not march in and hand my parents the deed. I placed the property into a blind, limited liability company. I became the registered agent and sole owner. A few days later, my parents received a formal letter from a law firm stating a mysterious local investor had purchased the debt and was allowing them to stay on the property indefinitely. I executed this transaction in total secrecy because of a conversation I had overheard just weeks prior. I had offered to help my parents with the mortgage. My mother looked at me from her kitchen counter, her face tight with pride. She said she would rather die in a ditch and take charity from a daughter who could not even provide a real family. She meant biological children. She meant my choice to adopt Leo was a failure in her eyes. So I let her keep her pride. I bought the farm. I paid the property taxes. I covered the homeowner insurance. For 5 years, I operated as the invisible bank, keeping the roof over her head, all while she praised my sister Natalie for helping them create a household budget. That brings us back to the present, a few days after the Jersey incident. My brother-in-law Brent called and asked to meet me at a coffee shop near my office. Brent is a residential real estate agent. He wears suits that fit a little too tight across the shoulders, and he drives a leased German sedan he constantly complains about fueling. He relies heavily on Natalie being the favorite daughter to secure his standing in my mother's eyes. He slid into the booth across from me holding a black coffee. He did not ask about Leo. He did not ask how my week was going. He leaned forward, checked over his shoulder, and lowered his voice. He needed a bridge loan, $20,000. He claimed the money was for a commercial development deal that was tied up in municipal red tape. He smiled that slick, rehearsed smile he uses on first-time homebuyers. He told me it would only be for 30 days. He promised a generous interest return. I sat perfectly still and let him talk. He was sweating. Then he made his fatal mistake. He leaned back against the vinyl booth and crossed his arms. I figured you had the disposable income lying around, Bella, since you avoided all those expensive hospital bills from a real pregnancy. I looked at his leased car parked outside the window. I looked at the nervous sweat forming on his upper lip. He was drowning in something. A desperate man is a predictable man. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend the validity of my son. Instead, I deployed a strategic diversion. I took a slow sip of my tea. I lowered my voice to match his conspiratorial tone. I told him I could not help. I told him my corporation was undergoing a structural realignment. I mentioned I had been sitting in closed-door meetings with our legal team all week. I said things were uncertain, layoffs were imminent, and my personal assets were temporarily frozen while I navigated the transition. I watched the blood drain from his face. Brent is not a smart man, but he understands the sudden absence of money. He assumed I was about to lose my job. He assumed the invisible safety net my parents always hinted at was vanishing. He stood up from the booth so fast he nearly spilled his coffee. He mumbled an excuse about a sudden client call and walked briskly out the front door. The fallout from that coffee took less than 4 hours. The news traveled from Brent to Natalie and straight to my mother. By Sunday dinner at the farm, the dynamic had shifted entirely. My mother operates on a strict currency of usefulness. For years, she tolerated my presence because she assumed I was wealthy enough to bail them out of emergencies. Now she believed the well was running dry. When you remove a narcissist's perceived benefit, they stop hiding their true nature. We sat in the living room while the roast cooked. Leo brought his sketch pad. He He was drawing the chassis of an Indy car. He is meticulous with his hobbies. He measures the wheelbase with a small plastic ruler. He held the drawing up to show my father. Richard smiled and reached out to look at the paper. My mother intercepted. She stepped between them and handed my father a stack of cloth napkins to fold. She did not even look at Leo. She told my father not to encourage the boy. She said he needed to focus on practical things because art was for people with trust funds. Then she turned and looked directly at me. She asked if I had updated my resume recently. She offered to introduce me to a friend who managed a local grocery store. She said honest hourly work builds character when the corporate world spits you out. She smiled when she said it, the polite Midwestern smile that hides a knife. She was testing the waters. She was showing me that my status had been downgraded. Since she believed my money was gone, she felt she no longer needed to hide her disdain for my son. She became brazen. I smiled back. I thanked her for the suggestion. I told her I would keep my options open. Across the room, I watched Brent pacing near the hallway. He was chewing his thumbnail. He was staring at the exposed brick of the farmhouse like he was calculating its square footage. He needed money. He thought I was broke. And my mother believed she was the true matriarch, standing on solid ground. They were rewriting the rules of engagement based on a lie I had fed them. They thought I was weak. They had no idea they were dancing on a trap door, and I held the lever. As we gathered our coats to leave that evening, my father mentioned the mail carrier had been skipping the house lately. He noted he was missing some official letters from the county. I zipped my coat. I knew exactly why the mail was missing. But I just nodded and told him to have a good night. The Indiana High School basketball tip-off game is louder than a commercial airport runway. The gymnasium smells like floor wax and roasted peanuts. It is the kind of place where seating arrangements dictate local social hierarchies. My parents secured a block of seats 3 rows behind the home bench. They arrived early to ensure the entire town saw them. My family wore their matching custom jerseys. The bright blue fabric featured their last names stitched across the shoulder blades in stark white lettering. Diane sat in the center. Richard sat to her right. Natalie and Brent flanked them with the twins. They looked like a catalog advertisement for Midwestern unity. Leo sat next to me at the far edge of the row. He wore a plain gray hooded sweatshirt. He watched the players run their layup drills on the hardwood below. He did not complain about being the only one without a uniform. I had offered to buy him a replica jersey from the Spirit store on the way to the game. He declined. He told me he preferred the gray sweater because it was warm. Children understand exclusion long before they possess the vocabulary to describe it. I sat next to him holding a bottle of water. I treated the game like a board meeting. I observed the board members. My sister Natalie is 2 years younger than me. She was a cheerleader who married the backup quarterback. She still acts like her primary purpose in life is maintaining a polished image for the town to admire. She spends her days curating social media posts that project an effortless existence. She relies entirely on our mother for emotional validation and relies on her husband to project financial stability. Since Brent was currently spiraling from his mysterious debt, Natalie was visibly anxious. She kept checking her reflection in her phone screen and fixing her hair. Halfway through the first quarter, the twins demanded snacks. Natalie let out a dramatic sigh. She stood up and announced she was going to the concession stand. She asked if anyone else needed a pretzel. Nobody did. She turned and walked down the bleacher stairs. She left her phone sitting on the wooden bench between her empty spot and my hip. I did not intend to look at her screen. I was watching the point guard call a play. Then the phone vibrated. The screen illuminated. A banner notification appeared at the top of the glass. It was a message from my mother. The sender name read Diane. The text preview was short. "Keep smiling, Natalie. Bella is paying for dinner tonight since she will not be able to afford it next month." The message was sent in a group thread. The title of the chat was printed bold at the very top of the notification: True Leach Bloodline. My heart did not speed up. My breathing remained perfectly even. In logistics, when you spot a discrepancy on a manifest, you do not panic. You audit the ledger. I picked up the device. Natalie uses a simple numeric passcode. It is the birth year of her twins. I typed the 4 digits. The device unlocked. I opened the messaging application. I entered the True Leech bloodline thread. The group contained my mother, my sister, my brother-in-law, and 2 of my aunts who live a county over. The chat history stretched back for months. I scrolled backward in time. It was a digital archive of their cruelty. I read messages from July where Natalie mocked the way Leo spoke. She called his quiet nature defective. I read replies from my mother agreeing, stating that you never know what kind of behavioral issues you inherit when you adopt outside the genetic pool. Brent chimed in with a joke about how I was playing savior to a stray. They complained about my corporate job. Natalie called me a robot in a blazer. My mother wrote that I lacked maternal instincts and used my paycheck to compensate for my personality. They tore apart everything from my haircut to my parenting style. I kept scrolling. The personal insults were irrelevant. I was looking for actionable intelligence. I found it in the messages sent over the last 48 hours immediately following my coffee meeting with Brent. The tone of the chat had shifted from casual mockery to frantic scheming. Brent had sent a long paragraph. He explained that my company was doing layoffs and my assets were frozen. He told the group I was going under. Natalie replied with a string of crying emojis. She asked what they were going to do about the country club dues and the family vacations I usually subsidized. Then I read the messages regarding the legacy farm. Brent wrote that he needed capital immediately. He said his commercial development deal was collapsing and his lenders were demanding payment. He proposed leveraging the farm. He told my mother that the property had enough equity to secure a short-term business loan. He said it would save his career. Natalie asked if that was legal. She pointed out that a mysterious investor owned the deed. My mother replied. Her response was a masterpiece of delusional entitlement. The farm is ours anyway. We have lived here for generations. That investor is just a holding company. Bella will just have to deal with it when she finds out. She owes us for embarrassing this family with that boy. Brent, get the paperwork ready. I will handle your father. I sat in the loud gymnasium. The buzzer sounded, signaling a foul on the court. The crowd groaned. I read my mother's message 3 times to ensure I understood the exact parameters of her plan. She was encouraging her son-in-law to extract equity from a property she did not own to save his failing career, all because she believed I was too weak and financially ruined to stop them. She was planning to use the house I bought to fund the people who hated my son. I did not close the application. I enacted a swift preservation of evidence. I used the button combination on the side of the device to capture images of the screen. I scrolled and captured another. I took 6 screenshots in total. They documented the insults toward Leo, the plotting by Brent, and the direct complicity of my mother. I opened the email application on Natalie's device. I attached the 6 images to a blank message. I typed in a secure secondary email address I use strictly for encrypted document storage. I pressed send. I went into the sent folder and deleted the outgoing email. I went into the trash folder and purged it. I returned to the messaging application and left it exactly on the screen where I had found it. I locked the device. I placed it back on the wooden bleacher bench parallel to the grain of the wood, precisely where it had been resting. The entire operation took less than 3 minutes. Natalie returned holding a cardboard tray filled with pretzels and cheese dip. She complained about the length of the line. She sat down, picked up her device, and unlocked it. She read something, smirked, and rapidly typed a reply. She was likely contributing another thought to the bloodline thread. She was entirely oblivious. She had no idea she had just handed me the coordinates to their destruction. I turned my attention back to the basketball game. I felt a profound sense of clarity. The ambiguity was gone. They had documented their treason in plain text. The emotional betrayal was now a verified asset. Leo tapped my arm. He pointed at the scoreboard. The home team was pulling ahead. He smiled. I smiled back and handed him a soft pretzel. The game ended with a victory for the local school. My parents celebrated as if they had personally coached the roster. We shuffled out of the gymnasium and into the cold parking lot. My mother suggested a celebratory dinner at a local steakhouse. She looked at me expectantly. She was waiting for me to pull out my credit card. I declined the invitation. I told her Leo was tired and we needed to get home. She scoffed, adjusting the collar of her custom jersey. She muttered something to Brent about how predictable I was. They drove away in their separate vehicles, confident in their secret alliance. I buckled Leo into the back seat of my sedan. I turned the heater on high. I did not drive toward our house right away. I had a different destination in mind. My mother had mentioned handling my father to secure the paperwork for Brent. I needed to see what was happening out at the 50-acre property. The next morning, I drove out to the farmhouse unannounced. I found my father in the detached garage working on his vintage automobile. What I heard in that garage confirmed that the theft had already begun. The morning after the basketball game carried a bitter frost. The Indiana sky was the color of bruised iron. I steered my sedan down the long gravel driveway of the 50-acre property. The tires crunched loudly against the frozen stones. I did not announce my visit. The intelligence I gathered from my sister's phone required immediate on-site verification. My mother had instructed her son-in-law to prepare the paperwork for a fraudulent commercial loan. She had promised to handle my father to secure whatever signature they needed. I needed to gauge the progress of her treason. I parked near the detached barn. The structure sat 100 yards from the main residence. It smelled of damp timber gasoline and old leaves. Inside, the space was dominated by a beautifully restored 1969 Ford Mustang. The vehicle was painted a deep metallic blue, reflecting the harsh fluorescent shop lights hanging from the rafters. In our region of the Midwest, muscle cars are a religion. My father, Richard, treated that garage like a sanctuary. He was bent over the exposed engine block, holding a silver socket wrench. He is a man who built immaculate machines, but runs away from human friction. Whenever his wife started a psychological war inside the house, he retreated to the barn. His passivity was the silent mortar that held her toxic bricks together. My son unbuckled his seatbelt before the car engine stopped running. He idolizes automobiles. He spends countless hours at our kitchen table assembling miniature replicas with tiny tweezers and clear plastic glue. When he saw the pristine Mustang resting in the bay, his eyes widened with pure joy. He ran up to the vehicle, stopping a respectful distance from the fresh paint. He looked at my father with genuine admiration and asked if he could help sand the gray primer on the front fender. Before Richard could hand the boy a piece of sandpaper, the side door of the barn swung open. My mother marched inside carrying a tray of steaming coffee mugs. She moved with a practiced, nervous urgency. She set the tray on a wooden workbench, stepped directly between my son and the vehicle, and grabbed Leo by his upper arm. She pulled him backward with a swift tug. She told him the car was a precious family heirloom. She stated it was not a toy for clumsy hands. I stepped into the doorway, remaining entirely out of her line of sight. I stood in the shadows near a tall stack of winter tires. I watched the scene unfold. My mother turned to her husband. She lowered her voice, but the acoustic resonance of the metal barn carried every syllable clearly to my ears. She told Richard they needed to be exceedingly careful with the restoration process because the vehicle was destined for Mason. She explicitly stated her biological grandson would receive the keys the moment he turned 16. She said Leo did not have racing in his blood. She claimed they did not know anything about his genetics, implying his origins made him unworthy of their mechanical legacy. I looked at the man holding the wrench. He wiped his dirty hands on a greasy shop rag. He looked at the cracked concrete floor. He looked at the polished fenders. He did not look at the 9-year-old boy standing 3 feet away. He did not defend his grandson. He chose the path of least resistance. He nodded a silent agreement to keep the peace with his wife. The betrayal was quiet, common, and utterly cowardly. To break the suffocating tension, Richard abruptly changed the subject. He cleared his throat and mentioned the local postal service. He complained that the mail carrier had been erratic lately. He noted he had not received any official correspondence from the county clerk office in over a week. He seemed annoyed, stating he was waiting on some routine property tax assessments and a notice about a zoning variance. I remained perfectly still in the shadows. My father had no idea why the county letters had stopped arriving at the farmhouse mailbox. The postal worker was not incompetent. The absence of mail was my specific design. 7 days prior, anticipating their greed, I had submitted an official change of address form for the limited liability company that owned the property. I legally diverted all correspondence regarding the 50-acre tract to my corporate headquarters in the city. Any document concerning the deed, any tax notice, and any loan application alert would bypass their rural mailbox completely. They were operating in total darkness. The storm was gathering directly above their heads, but they could not see the clouds because I controlled the weather. I did not step forward to cause a scene. Confronting my mother over a classic car would yield nothing but a theatrical argument. She wanted a reaction. She wanted to prove I was overly sensitive about the adoption. I refused to grant her that satisfaction. Instead, I focused on the immediate casualty. I watched Leo lower his head. His small shoulders slumped forward. He put his hands deep into his winter jacket pockets and took 3 slow steps away from the garage bay. I emerged from the shadows, feigning complete ignorance of their conversation. I kept my face devoid of emotion. I told my mother we only stopped by to retrieve a scarf I left behind on Sunday. I walked over to my son, placed a firm hand on his back, and guided him out of the cold barn. I did not say goodbye to the mechanic or his wife. I maintained my composure all the way back to the vehicle. We walked back to my sedan. I buckled Leo into his seat. I told him we would go to the hobby store and buy the biggest model kit they had in stock. He offered a faint, brave smile. I shut his door. Before I started the engine, I pulled my cellular phone from my pocket. The pieces were moving on the board. My mother was laying the groundwork for Brent to steal equity from the property. I scrolled to the contacts menu and dialed my corporate attorney. The phone rang twice. When the lawyer answered, I issued a single, decisive directive. I ordered him to place a hard monitor on the title of the farm and alert me the exact moment any unauthorized entity attempted a filing. The trap was set. Now I just had to wait for the fraud to cross the wire. In our section of the Midwestern Heartland, the annual Thanksgiving parade holds as much cultural significance as a mayoral election. The event takes place on the Wednesday afternoon before the holiday, drawing thousands of residents to the downtown square. Local businesses sponsor floats built on flatbed trailers pulled by heavy-duty farm tractors. For decades, the Leach family has maintained a prominent entry in the procession, showcasing vintage agricultural equipment and tossing caramel candies to the crowds lining the sidewalks. My son Leo spent the better part of 3 weeks preparing for this specific tradition. He approached the float design with the dedication of a structural engineer. He used grid paper to scale his drawings. He calculated the exact dimensions of my father's flatbed trailer, marking locations for the hay bales, the decorative corn stalks, and the antique wooden barrels. He used his colored pencils to shade the autumn leaves. Every evening, after finishing his homework, he sat at our kitchen table, refining the blueprints, imagining his place waving to the town alongside his grandfather. The illusion shattered on a Tuesday afternoon. Diane drove to my house under the guise of dropping off a casserole dish she had borrowed the previous month. She stood in my entryway wearing a pristine wool coat, her hands clasped together with an air of practiced innocence. She did not take her shoes off. She did not step further into the living room. She maintained a safe distance, scanning the interior of my home as if inspecting a hotel lobby. Leo heard her voice and walked out of his bedroom. He carried his grid paper sketches in his hands, eager to present his finalized float concepts to his grandmother. He stopped halfway down the hallway, offering a hopeful, shy smile. Diane did not acknowledge the drawings. She offered a tight, sympathetic grimace. It is a specific facial expression she utilizes right before delivering a calculated cruelty. She turned her attention to me and delivered the news. She claimed the township had updated their liability policies for the parade route. She said the municipal organizers were cracking down on safety protocols regarding the moving vehicles. She lowered her voice to a theatrical whisper, though the acoustics of my hallway ensured Leo heard every single syllable. She stated the new insurance regulations required strict adherence to family limits. She said only direct descendants were legally permitted to ride on the back of the family float this year. She told me she felt terrible about the sudden rule change, but she simply could not risk a lawsuit if an unauthorized passenger fell off the trailer. It was a brilliant, devastating lie. Municipal parade organizers in rural Indiana do not check birth certificates before allowing children to sit on hay bales. The entire town packs those trailers with neighbors, cousins, and classmates. The regulation did not exist. Diane had fabricated a bureaucratic excuse to enforce a genetic boundary. She wanted her biological grandchildren, Mason and Harper, to shine in the local spotlight without the visual disruption of an adopted child sitting beside them. I looked at my mother. I analyzed her posture. Her shoulders were relaxed. Her breathing was steady. She felt no remorse for the fabrication. She believed her deception was a necessary correction to maintain the purity of her public image. I turned my gaze to Leo. My son possesses a tragic familiarity with rejection. Children who navigate the foster care system learn to recognize the closing of a door long before the latch clicks. He did not argue with his grandmother. He did not ask questions about the insurance policy. He simply stopped walking. He looked down at the grid paper in his hands. He carefully aligned the edges of the sheets. He folded the blueprints in half. Then he folded them in half again, creating a small, tight square of paper. He turned around, walked into the kitchen, and dropped his weeks of meticulous planning into the wastebasket. I did not confront my mother in the entryway. I did not call her a liar. I thanked her for returning the casserole dish, opened the front door, and waited for her to exit my property. As soon as her vehicle disappeared down the street, I went into the kitchen, retrieved the folded grid paper from the trash, and placed it inside my briefcase. That afternoon, I retreated to my home office and locked the door. When you strip away the emotion from a betrayal, you are left with raw data. I needed to examine the financial architecture of my relationship with my parents. For 5 years, I had quietly subsidized their existence while they treated my child like a trespasser. I opened my secure banking portal and pulled the transaction history for the secondary credit card I maintained in Diane's name. The card was intended for household emergencies, utility overages, and incidental groceries. I paid the balance in full every 30 days. I scrolled through the ledger, scanning the rows of digital numbers. A specific transaction caught my eye. The date corresponded exactly with the weekend the custom basketball apparel had arrived at the farmhouse. The vendor was listed as a regional sporting goods manufacturer located 2 counties over. The charge was for $480. I clicked the transaction details to expand the itemized receipt. The purchase order listed 7 custom-stitched athletic garments. I sat back in my desk chair and stared at the glowing monitor. The air in the office felt incredibly thin. My mother had not used her own funds to orchestrate the tip-off game humiliation. She had used my line of credit. I had paid the invoice for the bright blue fabric. I had financed the white lettering across their shoulder blades. I had inadvertently supplied the capital for a performance designed to mock my own son. I had literally funded the uniform of his exclusion. Logistics directors are trained to eliminate inefficiencies in a supply chain. When a vendor provides defective materials, you do not request an apology. You sever the contract. I picked up my phone and called my corporate attorney. I instructed him to draft the necessary paperwork to alter the operating agreement of my real estate holding company. For half a decade, the limited liability company had acted as a blind shield. It kept my identity hidden from the public record, allowing my parents to reside on the 50-acre property without the embarrassment of knowing their daughter owned the roof over their heads. I ordered my lawyer to dissolve that privacy layer. I instructed him to file an immediate amendment with the state. I transferred the title of the farm directly into my personal name. This maneuver removed the shadow investor from the equation. I became the undeniable public owner of the Leach family estate. The deed now bore my signature for anyone with an internet connection to see. I stripped away their safety net and replaced it with a mirror. My attorney cautioned me that removing the privacy shield would provoke questions from the local tax assessor and potentially from my family should they ever check the county database. I informed him that questions were exactly what I intended to generate. I terminated the phone call and began the process of auditing every other financial tie I held to the farmhouse. I prepared spreadsheets detailing the property taxes, the structural insurance policies, and the maintenance fees I had silently covered since the foreclosure auction. I gathered the evidence of my hidden generosity, transforming it into a precise weapon of accountability. As I compiled the final financial report, a sudden chime echoed from my computer speakers. It was a priority alert from the county clerk digital monitoring system. I had set the notification protocol just 2 days prior, right after witnessing the hushed conversation in my father's garage. I opened the secure message. The screen displayed a scanned document bearing a fresh digital timestamp. My mother had not wasted any time. While she was standing in my entryway, lying to my son about parade regulations, her son-in-law was submitting paperwork to the local authorities. The document glowing on my monitor was a quitclaim deed. It was a legal instrument designed to transfer ownership of real estate. And printed at the bottom of the page, certifying the fraudulent transfer of my 50-acre property, was a forged signature waiting to be processed by the bank. The digital alert from the county clerk office glowed on my monitor. The notification was a brief, automated summary confirming a new document had been entered into the public record regarding the 50-acre property. It was not a routine tax assessment or a boundary survey. The classification code designated a transfer of ownership. I closed my laptop. I did not take time to process the betrayal in my home office. I retrieved my wool coat, picked up my car keys, and drove directly to the county courthouse in the center of town. The courthouse is an imposing limestone structure built in the early 1900s. It smells of floor wax, old binding glue, and bureaucratic stagnation. In rural Indiana, the legal machinery moves at a glacial pace. People rely on handshakes and personal relationships to bypass the sluggish system. That cultural habit is a weakness. It breeds a dangerous sense of informal entitlement. I prefer the rigid architecture of documentation. I walked up to the records window on the second floor. A woman with graying hair and reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain greeted me. I presented my driver license and my corporate identification. Because I had finalized the removal of the blind trust just hours earlier, the state database recognized me as the sole, undisputed owner of the parcel in question. I requested a physical copy of the filing that had triggered the morning alert. The clerk typed my information into her terminal. She frowned, noting that the document had just crossed her desk pending final verification. She walked over to a stack of incoming trays, pulled a thick sheaf of paper, and handed it across the counter. I took the documents to a small wooden table in the corner of the office. I sat down and began to read. In supply chain logistics, the discovery of a counterfeit component requires a methodical trace. You do not panic. You dissect the anomaly, line by line, until you find the exact point of contamination. The top page was a quitclaim deed. It is a legal instrument utilized to quickly transfer interest in real estate from one party to another. The text claimed that my limited liability company was formally surrendering all rights, title, and interest in the 50-acre farm. The recipient of the property was listed as Richard Leach. I turned to the second page to examine the execution block. For a holding company to surrender an asset, the registered agent must sign the authorization. Below the boilerplate legal jargon resting on the designated line was a signature purporting to be mine. It was a terrible forgery. The loops were hesitant. The pressure of the ink pen was uneven. It looked like someone had tried to trace my name from an old Christmas card. Beside the fake signature rested a bright blue notary stamp. The seal belonged to a man named Todd, a local insurance broker who frequently socialized with my brother-in-law. Brent has always operated on the fringes of the local real estate market. He sells entry-level starter homes while projecting the image of a high-rolling commercial developer. He routinely cuts corners, relying on a network of drinking buddies to expedite his paperwork. He had clearly convinced his associate to stamp the fraudulent deed without the required identification check. I turned to the third page. The true motive materialized in black and white. Attached to the fake quitclaim deed was a collateral application for a commercial business loan. Brent was attempting to leverage the farm. The requested capital amount was $150,000. He had listed my father as the primary guarantor, utilizing the newly forged deed to prove Richard owned the collateral free and clear. Brent was treating the generational farmhouse like an ATM to salvage whatever financial ruin he had gotten himself into. I traced my finger down the loan application. I found the section requiring a sworn affidavit of occupancy and consent. This clause demanded a signature from a spouse or cohabitant verifying the legitimacy of the collateral pledge, under penalty of perjury. That is where I found my mother. Diane had signed the affidavit. Her distinctive, looping cursive was rendered in dark black ink. I stared at her signature for a long time. The wooden chair beneath me felt very hard. The ambient noise of the courthouse faded into a low hum. My mother had crossed a profound threshold. I always knew she was a toxic narcissist who weaponized her affection to control her family. I knew she despised my son and resented my independence. But until I saw her handwriting on that sworn affidavit, I did not realize she was a criminal. Diane had committed wire fraud. She had knowingly participated in the forgery of a federal lending document. She risked a felony conviction and a prison sentence to secure capital for Natalie's husband. She did this because I fed them a diversion. I told Brent my corporation was downsizing and my assets were frozen. Diane believed the invisible investor protecting her home was about to vanish, and she assumed I would be too humiliated by my own financial collapse to monitor the county records. She thought she was being proactive. She thought she was protecting the true bloodline. She assumed she could steal the house right out from under me before I noticed it was gone. The average person would have picked up their cellular phone in that moment and dialed the police. The average person would have driven to the farmhouse, kicked the front door open, and demanded an explanation. I am not the average person. Calling the authorities would initiate a slow, messy investigation. It would give Brent time to hire a lawyer. It would give Diane time to craft a narrative portraying herself as a confused elderly victim manipulated by her son-in-law. She would weep in front of a judge and beg for leniency. I refused to grant her an audience for her tears. I viewed the situation the same way I view a critical vendor failure. When a supplier introduces a toxic element into your manufacturing process, you do not ask them for an apology. You gather the evidence, you prepare the termination contract, and you liquidate their involvement permanently. I stood up and walked back to the clerk. I asked her to generate certified, notarized copies of the entire packet. I watched her press the raised seal into the thick paper, locking the evidence into the official public record. I purchased a crisp manila folder from a supply rack near the elevators. I slid the certified documents inside, smoothing the heavy paper flat. The folder felt substantial in my hands. It was the physical manifestation of their ruin. I exited the courthouse and stepped into the freezing Midwestern air. The sky remained dark and overcast. I walked to my sedan, placed the manila folder on the passenger seat, and started the engine. Before I could shift the vehicle into drive, my phone vibrated in the cup holder. It was a text message from Diane. The message was a detailed grocery list for our upcoming Thanksgiving dinner. It included specific demands for organic produce and expensive artisan cheeses. The final sentence of the text read, "Make sure you pay for the good turkey this year, the large one from the local butcher." I read the message twice. My mother had just signed a fraudulent document to steal a $500,000 estate from me, and she was still demanding I purchase her holiday meal? The audacity was breathtaking. I did not reply to her message. I placed the phone face down on the console. The holiday was exactly 9 days away. I had an abundance of administrative tasks to complete before the turkey was carved. The legal trap was locked, but I needed to sever the structural support beams holding their daily lives together. I arrived at my corporate headquarters exceptionally early on the Monday before the holiday. The logistics floor was entirely vacant, bathed in the cool glow of the emergency overhead lights. I brewed a cup of dark roast coffee in the break room, walked to my polished mahogany desk, and woke my dual monitors. In supply chain management, when a vendor violates their contract through malicious negligence, you do not send a polite warning letter. You initiate an immediate, systematic freeze of all shared resources. You cut the supply lines. I opened my secure personal banking portal. I bypassed the county property tax ledger completely. Government bureaucracy moves far too slowly for a tactical strike. A missed tax payment takes months to register any tangible impact on the occupants of a home. I required consequences that would detonate precisely when the carving knife pierced the holiday bird. I navigated to my telecommunications provider. For 6 years, I had maintained the primary cellular family plan. It covered my own device, Leo's emergency tablet, my father's rugged smartphone, and my mother's premium model. Diane utilized her phone continuously to curate her superficial social standing and to orchestrate the toxic group chat that mocked my son. I clicked the line management tab. I selected the 2 phone numbers belonging to my parents. I did not suspend them temporarily. I issued a permanent cancellation order. The digital confirmation screen informed me that service would terminate at midnight on Wednesday. They would wake up on Thanksgiving morning holding dead, unresponsive rectangles of glass. They would have no cellular data, no texting capabilities, and no ability to coordinate their daily gossip. Next, I accessed the auto insurance portal. I funded the comprehensive coverage for my father's heavy-duty pickup truck and my mother's luxury crossover vehicle. Driving an uninsured car in Indiana is a severe offense, especially if pulled over during a highly patrolled holiday weekend. I revoked their active policies, requesting an immediate electronic receipt of termination. I then moved to the utility accounts. I canceled the automated drafts for the farmhouse electricity, the rural water line, and the propane heating service. By Wednesday afternoon, the utility companies would automatically dispatch billing failure alerts to the property. The digital guillotine was falling in silent, devastating increments, stripping away the invisible safety net they had taken for granted for over half a decade. The financial severances were merely the opening volley. I opened a blank legal template on my word processor. I drafted a formal 30-day notice to vacate the premises. I kept the language devoid of emotion, citing the specific legal statutes of our county regarding tenant removal. I did not list them as beloved family members. I identified them solely as unauthorized occupants residing on my private real estate. I loaded the bypass tray of my office printer with a stack of our heavy-grade, watermarked corporate stock paper. The machine hummed to life, producing a crisp, flawless document. I signed the bottom line with a black fountain pen. The thick paper felt substantial between my fingers. It carried the undeniable weight of a finalized verdict. Retaliation requires cold precision, but collateral damage must be minimized. Leo was the innocent bystander in this genetic war. He was going to witness the ugly, chaotic destruction of his extended family, and he needed an immediate structural reinforcement to remind him he was valued above all else. I opened a new browser window and navigated to the official ticketing platform for the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. I purchased 2 premium VIP garage access passes for that upcoming Friday. The package included a guided pit lane tour and a private meet and greet with a prominent racing team. I printed the confirmation vouchers and slid them into a sleek white envelope with his name written on the front. No matter how brutal the holiday dinner became, he would wake up the next morning possessing a golden ticket to his wildest mechanical dreams. He would know that his mother protected his passions. I cleared my desk of everything except my black leather professional portfolio. I began the final assembly process. This binder was the payload. I placed the authentic, certified deed proving my sole ownership of the 50-acre parcel into the first clear sleeve. Behind it, I inserted the printed screenshots of their group chat, laying bare their cruelty and their panicked scheming. In the third slot, I slid the notarized copies of the forged quitclaim deed and the fraudulent commercial loan application bearing my mother's sworn, perjured signature. Finally, I placed the watermarked eviction notice at the very back. I zipped the leather portfolio shut. It was dense. It contained the complete dissolution of the Leach family myth. The next 72 hours passed with agonizing slowness. I attended my scheduled corporate meetings. I packed our overnight bags. I did not answer the single text message Diane sent on Wednesday afternoon asking what time I planned to arrive with the artisan cheeses and the expensive turkey. Thursday afternoon finally materialized. The Indiana sky was a flat slate gray, threatening a heavy frost. I drove my sedan down the familiar rural highway, turning onto the long gravel driveway of the estate. The tires crunched rhythmically against the stones. Leo sat quietly in the passenger seat. He wore a clean collared shirt and held a $10 fast food gift card my mother had mailed him weeks prior as an early, thoughtless holiday present. He traced the plastic edges of the card with his thumb. He looked out the window at the barren cornfields and asked if we were staying for the entire weekend. I kept my eyes on the path ahead. I told him we would only stay until the truth was served. I parked the vehicle near the front porch. The farmhouse looked picturesque, framed by bare oak trees and a thin layer of early snow. It projected the exact image of Midwestern stability my mother fought so desperately to maintain. I gripped the sturdy handle of my leather portfolio. I stepped out of the car. As we approached the heavy wooden front door, the rich aromas of roasting turkey, warm cinnamon, and baking yeast drifted through the cracked window pane. It smelled exactly like a traditional Heartland holiday. It smelled like a warm, loving home. But I knew better. Beneath the scent of the roasted bird and the spiced apples, the cold air carried the distinct metallic tang of impending ruin. We stepped through the heavy oak front door of the farmhouse, and the wall of heated air hit us immediately. The interior was a masterclass in manufactured Midwestern hospitality. A fire crackled in the stone hearth. Extended relatives from neighboring counties filled the living room, holding crystal tumblers of bourbon and laughing at familiar anecdotes. The television played a football game on low volume. It was a picturesque tableau of domestic harmony, entirely obscuring the rot beneath the floorboards. I walked into the foyer holding Leo by the hand, carrying the large roasted turkey I had purchased from the local butcher earlier that morning. My heavy black leather portfolio was tucked firmly under my opposite arm. My mother Diane held court near the fireplace. She wore a tailored burgundy dress, a string of pearls, and a smile that did not reach her eyes. She noticed my arrival and gracefully took the butcher paper package from my hands. She handed it off to my sister Natalie without offering a single word of gratitude. Diane immediately pivoted back to her audience of aunts and cousins. She raised her voice, ensuring her words carried over the ambient noise of the crowded room. She began to deliver a rehearsed monologue about the 50-acre estate. She gestured expansively toward the large bay windows overlooking the frozen fields. She called the property the ultimate Leach legacy. She told our relatives that land was the only true measure of a bloodline. She placed a hand on the shoulder of her biological grandson, Mason, announcing to the entire room that one day the deed to the farm would be transferred directly to him. She painted a grand vision of the boy raising his own children on the same soil his ancestors had plowed. She spoke of generational wealth and undeniable birthrights, absorbing the admiring nods of her siblings and cousins. The dramatic irony of her speech was a tangible weight in the room. Diane was selling a generational fantasy to an audience of gullible relatives. She was promising away a $500,000 asset she did not possess. I walked over to the floral sofa and took a seat. I placed my leather portfolio upright against my right leg. Inside that dark binder rested the certified county document proving I was the sole proprietor of every blade of grass she was currently boasting about. I kept my face entirely neutral. I did not interrupt her performance. I simply cataloged the depth of her delusion. After Diane finished her speech, she clapped her hands together. She announced it was time for the early holiday gift exchange, a fabricated tradition she invented just to showcase her supposed generosity in front of a captive audience. Natalie gathered her twins, Mason and Harper, pushing them to the center of the living room rug. Diane produced 2 large, beautifully wrapped boxes tied with silver ribbons. The twins tore through the paper. They pulled out premium, authentic racing jackets from a top-tier motorsport team. The garments featured embroidered logos and heavy winter lining. The extended family murmured their approval, praising Diane for such an extravagant purchase. Leo stood near the edge of the sofa, watching the twins try on their expensive coats. He did not ask for a box. He kept his hands in his pockets. Diane turned toward him, her face adopting that familiar, tight mask of false sympathy. She reached into her dress pocket and pulled out a bare, unwrapped piece of plastic. It was the $10 gift card to a generic fast food chain. She extended her arm, holding the plastic square out to my son. She spoke loud enough for the aunts and cousins to hear. She stated she was not quite sure what boys like him were into, implying his interests were foreign and unworthy of actual consideration. She claimed it was difficult to shop for a child when you do not share any common history. My son did not flinch. He possesses a quiet dignity that eclipses every adult in that room. He stepped forward, accepted the bare plastic card, and offered a polite word of thanks. He walked back to my side and sat down on the sofa cushion. He did not look at the racing jackets again. I placed a steadying hand on his knee. The contrast between my mother's deliberate cruelty and my son's resilient grace was the final confirmation I needed. Any lingering hesitation about my impending retaliation evaporated into the warm air of the farmhouse. My brother-in-law, Brent, leaned against the archway leading to the kitchen. He held a bottle of imported beer, looking remarkably smug for a man currently drowning in offshore sports betting debt. He swaggered over to the sofa, towering over me. He offered a condescending smirk. He asked how the corporate restructuring was going. He lowered his voice to a mocking whisper, asking if I was prepared for the upcoming layoffs I had mentioned during our coffee meeting. He suggested I might need to downgrade my lifestyle soon, adding that the family would try to help me out if things got too rough. He was radiating false confidence. He genuinely believed his fraudulent commercial loan application was processing successfully. He thought my financial ruin was a guaranteed certainty. I looked up at him from my seated position. I did not correct his misconception. I gave him a slow, deliberate nod. I told him I was preparing for a significant structural realignment and that everything would be resolved by the end of the day. He chuckled, interpreting my response as an admission of defeat. He walked away to join Natalie near the kitchen island, whispering something in her ear that made her laugh. Across the living room, my father, Richard, watched the entire sequence of events. He stood near the hallway holding a glass of iced tea. He had heard his wife humiliate his adopted grandson with the gift card. He had heard his son-in-law mock my career. Richard shifted his weight from one foot to the other. His expression was a portrait of deep, uncomfortable cowardice. He knew the treatment was wrong, but intervening required a spine he misplaced decades ago. He looked down at the ice cubes in his glass, choosing the comfort of silence over the duty of protection. He was a spectator in his own home, willfully blind to the mechanics of the abuse happening right in front of him. The afternoon stretched on, filled with superficial chatter and the clinking of expensive glassware. I remained anchored to the floral sofa. My posture was flawless. I operated like a surveillance camera, recording every slight, every boast, and every condescending glance. In logistics, you allow a failing system to operate until you have mapped every point of failure. The leather portfolio resting against my leg felt like a loaded weapon with the safety disengaged. I was merely waiting for the designated target to step into the crosshairs. At exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Diane moved to the center of the dining room. The large oak table was set with fine china, polished silverware, and a centerpiece of autumn foliage. The roasted turkey I had provided sat perfectly carved on a silver platter. Diane picked up a small silver bell from the wooden sideboard. She rang it 3 times. The sharp, clear chime cut through the ambient noise of the living room, commanding immediate attention. She smiled brightly at the gathered crowd. She announced that dinner was finally ready. Then she delivered the closing line of her performance. She asked the real family to please take their seats at the main table. The phrasing was intentional. It was the ultimate exclusionary boundary setting the stage for a meal designed to isolate my son. I stood up from the sofa, picked up my heavy leather portfolio, and took Leo by the hand. The wait was over. The audit was about to begin. The dining room of the farmhouse featured a long, heavy oak table capable of seating 12 people comfortably. Diane had meticulously arranged the place cards. Mason and Harper were seated next to Natalie and Brent. The extended relatives occupied the remaining central chairs. My father sat at the far end carving the roasted bird. I was assigned a seat near the swinging kitchen door. It was the traditional spot for the family member expected to fetch extra gravy and clear the empty plates. My son was not assigned a chair at the main table. Diane had set up a flimsy metal folding chair in the adjoining hallway, positioned near a drafty window. She draped a thin tablecloth over a television tray, claiming the main dining area simply lacked the necessary square footage to accommodate everyone. It was a glaring physical manifestation of his exile. The hallway was poorly lit, casting long shadows against the floral wallpaper. Leo sat on the cold metal seat holding a plastic fork. He did not complain. Foster care teaches a child to accept whatever small space they are granted without protest. I sat at the main table, my leather portfolio resting on the hardwood floor against my ankle. I allowed this final indignity to occur because an auditor must witness the full extent of the systemic failure before issuing the penalty. The meal commenced with the passing of porcelain serving dishes and the hollow clatter of silverware. The room filled with the superficial hum of Midwestern pleasantries. The aunts praised the tenderness of the meat. Brent boasted about a fabricated commercial real estate prospect speaking loud enough for my father to hear. Natalie complained about the high cost of private school tuition, shooting a pointed glance in my direction. Diane presided over the gathering like a monarch holding court. She poured expensive red wine into crystal glasses, offering endless toasts to the legacy of the Leach bloodline and the enduring strength of our family roots. The air grew thick with the scent of sage stuffing and unchecked narcissism. I observed my father. Richard focused entirely on slicing the roasted breast meat. He kept his eyes locked on his plate, chewing his food with methodical, silent rhythm. He heard his daughter being treated like a servant. He saw his grandson banished to the dark hallway. Yet he chose the familiar comfort of cowardice. He preferred the illusion of a peaceful holiday dinner over the difficult reality of defending an innocent child. His silence was just as toxic as the overt cruelty flowing from his wife. 30 minutes into the meal, a minor logistical failure occurred. Leo accidentally dropped his paper napkin onto the hallway floor. The thin material absorbed a spilled drop of cranberry sauce, rendering it unusable. He needed a replacement. Because he is a polite, well-behaved boy, he did not shout across the rooms to demand service. He quietly stood up from his folding chair and walked toward the dining room threshold to ask for a clean napkin. He stopped in the doorway, waiting patiently for a break in the adult conversation. At that exact moment, Diane was holding the neck of a dark green wine bottle. She was leaning across the corner of the oak table toward my sister Natalie. Diane wore a self-satisfied smirk, flushed from the alcohol and the captive audience. She did not bother to check her surroundings. She assumed Leo was out of earshot, sequestered in his designated corner. Diane lowered her voice slightly, though the timbre of her words carried with crystal clarity over the quiet hum of chewing and clinking glasses. She poured a generous measure of wine into the glass and delivered the fatal sentence. "He is not really ours. Let us be honest. We should not have to pretend on a holiday." The words hung in the warm air, suspended like dust particles caught in a shaft of sunlight. I turned my head toward the doorway. Leo was standing perfectly still. His small hands were gripped tight around the edge of his gray sweater. I watched his face shatter. The hopeful, resilient light in his brown eyes extinguished instantly. His lower lip trembled. The inherent tragedy of a child realizing they are fundamentally unwanted washed over his expression. He had endured the missing basketball jersey. He had endured the fake insurance regulations keeping him off the parade float. He had accepted the $10 gift card and the folding chair in the drafty hallway. But hearing his grandmother explicitly deny his existence as a member of the family broke the final barrier of his endurance. In that fraction of a second, the 12 layers of restraint I had maintained for 5 years evaporated. The stoic corporate mask I wore to survive my family dissolved into pure, freezing clarity. In supply chain management, there is a specific protocol for dealing with a catastrophic structural failure. You cease all normal operations immediately. You isolate the hazard. You execute the termination sequence. I did not scream. I did not throw my plate. I did not engage in the chaotic emotional theater my mother thrived upon. I placed my cloth napkin on the table. I pushed my chair back. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. The sound was harsh, cutting through the murmurs of the extended relatives. The room began to quiet down as heads turned in my direction. I bent down and picked up the heavy black leather portfolio from the floor. The weight of the certified documents, the printed text messages, and the eviction notice felt solid and final in my grip. I stood up slowly to my full height. I walked around the edge of the large oak table. I ignored the confused stares of my aunts and cousins. I ignored Brent and his arrogant smirk. I walked directly to the hallway threshold. I knelt down until I was at eye level with my son. I reached out and took his small, trembling hand in mine. His fingers were cold. I squeezed them gently, offering a silent promise of permanent protection. I stood back up, keeping his hand securely locked in my grasp. I turned to face the dining room. The ambient noise died out. The football game on the television in the adjacent room became the only sound echoing through the house. 40 pairs of eyes stared at me. My mother froze with the wine bottle still hovering over my sister. The self-satisfied smirk slid off her face, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. She had expected me to lower my head and endure the insult. She had expected the invisible bank to absorb the abuse in silence, just as I had done for decades. I looked directly into my mother's eyes. I did not blink. I projected my voice utilizing the flat, dead-level cadence of a corporate executive delivering a terminal audit. The tone was devoid of anger, sadness, or hesitation. It was a cold, unyielding recitation of fact. Since we are being honest, I raised my free hand and tossed the heavy leather portfolio through the air. The black binder flew across the short distance and landed squarely in the dead center of the massive oak table. The impact generated a loud, percussive thud that rattled the fine china. The corner of the heavy portfolio clipped the base of Diane's crystal wine glass. The delicate stem snapped. The glass tipped over, spilling a spreading pool of dark red liquid across the pristine white linen tablecloth. The stain expanded rapidly, seeping into the fabric like a deep, irreversible wound. The story had returned to the exact moment the fuse was lit. The theater of their Midwestern warmth was officially closed. The legal execution was underway. The dark red wine soaked into the pristine white linen tablecloth. The spreading stain mirrored the sudden and irreversible shift in the room. Nobody moved to grab a towel. The aunts and cousins who had just been applauding my mother and her generational wealth speech now sat frozen in their wooden chairs. The only sound was the muffled commentary of the football game broadcasting from the living room television. I kept my grip firm on Leo. His small hand anchored me to the present reality. He was safe. The retaliation phase had officially started. I did not raise my voice. I directed my attention to the head of the table. I looked at the man tasked with carving the roasted bird. Open the binder, Richard. My father has spent his entire adult life avoiding confrontation. He prefers the predictable mechanics of internal combustion engines to the messy reality of human conflict. He stared at the black leather portfolio resting near the spilled wine. He blinked, unsure how to process a direct command from his daughter in front of his extended relatives. Open it and read the first page aloud. Richard slowly set the carving knife down on the silver platter. He wiped his hands on his cloth napkin. He reached across the table and unzipped the portfolio. The metal zipper teeth made a sharp, rasping noise. He pulled out the top document housed inside the clear plastic sleeve. It was the certified deed to the 50-acre property stamped with the raised seal of the county clerk. He adjusted his reading glasses. He read the printed header. He scanned the legal description of the property boundaries. Then his eyes drifted down to the section denoting the current property owner. He stopped reading. His brow furrowed. He looked at the paper, then looked at me, and then looked back at the paper. He did not understand the text in front of him. The document directly contradicted the reality he had inhabited for 5 years. Read the name of the owner, Richard. He cleared his throat. His voice sounded thin and raspy. Bella Leach. A collective gasp rippled through the dining room. An older aunt sitting near the cranberry sauce covered her mouth with her hand. My sister Natalie stopped chewing her food, her fork hovering in midair. My mother Diane sat rigidly in her chair. The blood drained from her face, leaving her skin a pale, chalky gray. The grand illusion she had spent the entire afternoon building crumbled into dust in a matter of seconds. The prestigious legacy she had just promised to her biological grandson was revealed as a hollow fabrication. I addressed the entire table, maintaining my even courtroom cadence. 5 years ago, this farm was scheduled for the foreclosure auction block. The manufacturing business failed, and the bank called the debt. I sat in a downtown office and liquidated my corporate stock options. I wrote a check for $400,000 to save this roof. I placed the property into a blind trust because my mother explicitly stated she would rather die in a ditch than accept financial assistance from a daughter who could not provide a real family. For 5 years, I have been the invisible bank. I paid the property taxes, I maintained the structural insurance, I subsidized the utilities. I funded this pristine Midwestern lifestyle while you treated my son like trash. The silence in the room deepened. The extended relatives exchanged bewildered glances. They had attended this holiday dinner expecting a display of traditional stability. Instead, they were witnessing the financial dissection of their host. Brent snapped out of his stunned stupor. His survival instincts kicked in. He understood that if my ownership was public, his fraudulent loan application was in severe jeopardy. He shoved his chair back and lunged across the table, his hand reaching for the leather binder. "This is a trick," he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "She printed fake papers to ruin the holiday. Do not listen to her. She is lying." I fixed my gaze on him. I did not flinch as he reached across the roasted turkey. I delivered a single, icy directive. "Do not touch my property, Brent. Sit back down." The authority in my voice halted his momentum. He hovered over the table, his hand inches from the leather cover, suspended in a state of terrified hesitation. He slowly retracted his arm and sank back into his chair, breathing heavily. His face was flushed with frantic sweat. I shifted my focus back to the head of the table. "Turn to the second page, Richard. There is more." My father looked like a man standing on the deck of a sinking ship. He pulled the next document from the binder. It was the notarized packet from the county courthouse. He examined the top sheet. It was the fraudulent quitclaim form. He read the text. He saw the forged signature transferring my property into his name. He shook his head, muttering that he had never seen this paper in his life. "Keep reading," I instructed. "Look at the commercial loan application attached underneath." Richard flipped the page. He scanned the financial request. $150,000. He saw his own name listed as the primary guarantor. He saw the forged signature at the bottom of the page, pledging the 50-acre farm as collateral for a business loan he knew nothing about. The betrayal was severe, but the final blow had yet to land. "Look at the sworn affidavit of occupancy, Richard. Look at the witness signature line." He traced his finger down the heavy paper. His finger stopped near the blue notary stamp. He stared at the looping cursive ink. He recognized the handwriting instantly. It was the same distinct penmanship that wrote the holiday grocery lists and signed the annual Christmas cards. It was his wife. Diane had signed the legal document as a sworn witness. She had legally verified a fabricated transfer of wealth. She had actively participated in felony wire fraud. The silver fork Richard was holding slipped from his fingers. It clattered loudly against his porcelain dinner plate. His hands began to shake with uncontrollable tremors. He looked at Diane. She refused to meet his eyes. She stared at the spilled wine on the tablecloth, her jaw clenched tight. The woman who had just boasted about bloodlines and heritage had risked a federal prison sentence to fund her favored son-in-law. She had jeopardized the freedom of her own husband to maintain the charade of superiority. Brent realized the walls were closing in rapidly. The forged documents were now public knowledge in front of a dozen witnesses. He started talking fast, weaving a desperate narrative to excuse the crime. He threw his hands up in a placating gesture. "It is not what it looks like, Richard," he stammered, his eyes darting frantically around the room. "It was a temporary measure. I was expanding my commercial real estate portfolio. I found a lucrative development deal that required immediate bridge capital. I was doing it for the family. The return on investment would have doubled our net worth by spring. I was going to pay the loan back before anyone even noticed. Diane knew it was a guaranteed win. We were just trying to secure the Leach legacy for the next generation." He was sweating profusely, now wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. He was trying to frame felony fraud as an ambitious entrepreneurial misstep. He was attempting to paint himself as a misunderstood provider who just needed a little leverage to make everyone rich. He looked at Natalie, silently begging his wife to defend him. Natalie sat frozen, tears pooling in her eyes, finally understanding that her husband was not a successful businessman, but a desperate criminal who had just destroyed her parents. Brent kept rambling, spinning his web of excuses thicker and thicker. He talked about projected revenue streams and municipal zoning approvals. He thought he could talk his way out of a federal crime by using industry jargon. He assumed he could confuse my father and manipulate the extended relatives into viewing him as a victim of bad timing. He had no idea I had already run a comprehensive background check on his financial history. He had no idea his fabricated real estate development deal was about to be exposed as a devastating lie. I stood at the threshold of the hallway, holding my son's hand, letting Brent dig his own grave with every panicked syllable. The trap had sprung, but the final mechanism of his ruin was still resting inside my coat pocket, waiting to be delivered. Brent continued his desperate monologue for another 60 seconds. He threw around industry buzzwords, hoping to construct a smokescreen thick enough to hide his impending incarceration. He mentioned tiered interest rates, municipal zoning approvals, and expedited permit applications. He spoke with the frantic, breathless cadence of a cornered animal chewing through a steel snare. The aunts and cousins watched him with wide, horrified eyes. The silence from the rest of the room only amplified his frantic pitch. He was sweating profusely, the moisture glistening on his forehead under the warm glow of the dining chandelier. He loosened his expensive silk tie, pleading with the audience to understand his visionary entrepreneurial spirit. I allowed him to exhaust his vocabulary. When his voice finally trailed off into a ragged, breathless pause, I reached into the interior breast pocket of my tailored wool coat. I did not pull out another property deed. I retrieved a tri-folded stack of standard white printer paper. This specific document was not generated by the county clerk. It was compiled by my corporate attorney, utilizing the services of a private financial investigator. I unfolded the pages. I smoothed the sharp creases against the edge of the dining surface. I kept my gaze fixed on my brother-in-law. The false confidence instantly evaporated from his posture, replaced by raw, unadulterated terror. I addressed the silent audience, maintaining my flat, unwavering cadence. I explained that the $150,000 loan application was never intended for a commercial real estate venture. I read directly from the investigator summary. There were no municipal zoning permits pending in his name. There were no construction contracts waiting for a signature. There was no development deal. I shifted my eyes to my sister. I told Natalie the truth about her husband. Brent was funneling capital through digital portals based in offshore tax havens. He wagered heavily on collegiate athletics and professional sporting events. The forensic accounting mapped a clear, undeniable trajectory of escalating financial ruin. He had lost $50,000 on football point spreads in October alone. The golden child husband was not a misunderstood visionary seeking bridge capital to secure a lucrative contract. He was a degenerate gambler drowning in six-figure debt, and he was attempting to steal my generational property to appease a syndicate of aggressive bookies. Natalie sat frozen in her upholstered chair. The carefully curated illusion of her perfect suburban existence fractured into 1,000 jagged splinters. She turned her head slowly, looking at the man she married. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged from her throat. The realization hit her with the concussive force of a physical blow. The leased luxury vehicles, the country club memberships, and the endless social media bragging about their affluent lifestyle were all constructed on a crumbling foundation of catastrophic betting losses. She let out a sharp, ragged gasp. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over her mascara, ruining the flawless makeup she had spent hours applying. She buried her face in her hands and began to weep, mourning the sudden public death of her pristine social status. I shifted my focus away from the weeping sister and the ruined husband. I transitioned seamlessly into the role of a logistics director terminating a compromised vendor account. I addressed my parents, outlining the precise schedule of their impending administrative blackout. I informed them that their cellular family plan was officially canceled. At the stroke of midnight on Wednesday, their glowing screens would go permanently dark. They would lose their primary method of communication. They would no longer possess the capability to coordinate their toxic gossip or project their fake wealth to the outside world. Next, I detailed the revocation of their automotive insurance policies. The comprehensive coverage for the heavy-duty pickup truck and the luxury crossover vehicle would cease to exist by Thursday morning. I reminded them that operating uninsured motor vehicles on public Indiana roadways constituted a severe legal offense, advising them to leave their cars parked in the gravel driveway. Then I listed the utility terminations. The rural water line, the electricity, and the propane heating services were scheduled for disconnection. The automated drafts funding their comfortable environment were permanently erased from my ledger. The invisible safety net they had abused for half a decade was gone. They were about to face the freezing Midwestern winter without my subsidized warmth. To ensure the criminal conspiracy was fully neutralized, I delivered a final piece of administrative news. I looked directly at Brent. I told him the regional commercial lender processing his fraudulent loan application received an official fraud alert at noon. My attorney provided the bank underwriter with the certified proof of my sole ownership. The transaction was dead. The financial institution flagged the file for internal review, meaning local law enforcement would likely initiate a formal investigation into the forged signatures within the week. My mother, Diane, began to hyperventilate. She clutched the string of pearls resting against her collarbone. She gasped for air, her chest heaving beneath her burgundy dress. She looked wildly around the room, desperate to find a sympathetic ally among the extended relatives. The aunts and cousins stared back at her with expressions ranging from profound disgust to chilling pity. Nobody offered a single word of defense. Realizing she was entirely isolated, Diane resorted to her final, pathetic strategy. She attempted to play the victim. She pleaded with me across the ruined dinner setting. She claimed the entire situation was a tragic misunderstanding. She swore her intentions were pure, insisting she merely wanted to protect the Leach legacy for the upcoming generations. She begged me not to destroy the family heritage over a simple miscommunication regarding a piece of paper. I reached into the leather binder one last time. I extracted the formal, watermarked eviction notice printed on my heavy corporate stock paper. I walked around the perimeter of the oak table until I stood directly beside her chair. I placed the legal document onto her porcelain dinner plate, resting it right on top of a dollop of mashed potatoes. The 30-day countdown clock to their physical removal was now a tangible reality. Diane stared at the eviction notice, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. Before she could formulate another excuse, I produced the final piece of evidence. I retrieved the printed screenshots of the True Leech Bloodline group chat. I held the stack of papers high in the air. I let go. The pages fluttered down like toxic snow. They scattered across the dining table. They landed in the gravy boat. They rested against the crystal wine glasses. They draped over the carved turkey breast. The extended relatives leaned forward, their eyes scanning the highlighted text messages. They read the cruel jokes about my adopted son. They read the malicious insults directed at my career. They read the explicit, premeditated plans to leverage the farmhouse behind my back. The undeniable proof of their hatred was served alongside the holiday feast, destroying any lingering claims of a misunderstanding. I turned my back on my hyperventilating mother. I walked over to my purse, which was resting near the foyer threshold. I unzipped the side compartment. I pulled out a crisp, fresh $10 bill. I walked back to the center of the room. I located the generic fast food gift card Diane had handed to Leo just an hour earlier, intending to humiliate him. The cheap plastic square was resting near the centerpiece of autumn foliage. I smoothed the paper currency flat. I placed the $10 bill directly beside the insulting gift card. I looked at my mother one last time. I delivered the final, terminating sentence of our relationship. That covers Leo and my share of the turkey. We would not want to owe you. The $10 bill rested crisp and green against the ruined white tablecloth. It sat directly beside the cheap plastic gift card, a physical monument to the end of my financial obligations. The dining room plunged into a suffocating silence. The ambient chatter from the extended relatives had vanished entirely. The only sound in the farmhouse was the low, distant drone of the television broadcasting a football game to an empty living room. I kept my hand wrapped securely around my son. I did not need to issue any further directives. The evidence I laid upon the oak table possessed enough gravity to crush the remaining oxygen out of the room. The audit was complete, but the collateral damage was just beginning to manifest. My father sat at the far end of the dining arrangement. For 34 years, Richard Leech utilized silence as his primary survival mechanism. He built impenetrable walls out of indifference. Whenever my mother initiated a psychological war inside the house, he retreated to his detached garage to avoid the toxic crossfire. He convinced himself that keeping the peace was an honorable sacrifice. He equated avoiding arguments with maintaining a stable household. Sitting at the head of that table, holding a carving fork he had forgotten to put down, the illusion of his honor evaporated. I watched him process the wreckage scattered across the porcelain plates. He stared at the quitclaim deed bearing a fraudulent signature. He read the commercial loan application designed to funnel equity into an offshore betting syndicate. He saw the printed group chat logs resting in the gravy boat, exposing the calculated cruelty his wife harbored against my son. He absorbed the reality that Diane had risked federal prison to subsidize a man addicted to point spreads, all while orchestrating a public humiliation for a 9-year-old boy. Richard turned his gaze toward Brent. My brother-in-law was shrinking into his upholstered seat, refusing to make eye contact with anyone in the room. His arrogant swagger was entirely gone, replaced by the trembling posture of a man facing imminent legal and financial ruin. Natalie continued to weep softly, her face buried in her hands, mourning the evaporation of her pristine social standing. They offered no defense because there was no defense left to manufacture. The truth was written in black ink and certified by the county clerk. Then my father looked past the dining room table. He directed his attention toward the dim hallway threshold. He looked at Leo. My son stood remarkably still. A single tear had tracked down his cheek, catching the ambient light from the chandelier overhead. Despite the moisture on his face, his chin remained lifted. Leo possessed a quiet, unyielding bravery that none of the adults in that room could ever hope to replicate. He had endured their rejection, their fake parade regulations, and their empty gift cards, yet he remained fundamentally good. He did not possess an ounce of their malice. That visual contrast acted as a catalyst. The dam broke. The decades of cowardly silence shattered. Richard dropped the heavy silver carving fork onto his ceramic plate. The sharp clatter rang like a gunshot through the silent room. He stood up from his chair. His posture was rigid, his shoulders pulled back. The color returned to his face, manifesting as a deep, angry flush that spread from his collar to his hairline. He turned his attention directly to the woman he married. He did not scream. A screaming man is out of control. Richard spoke with a low, trembling rumble that vibrated with raw disgust. The timbre of his voice commanded the immediate attention of every aunt and cousin sitting at the table. He demanded to know how she could justify her actions. He pointed a calloused finger at the forged legal documents scattered near the carved turkey. He asked her how she could commit a felony to protect a degenerate gambler. He asked how she could sign a sworn affidavit to steal the very roof over their heads, a roof purchased in secret by the daughter she despised. Richard leaned forward, bracing his hands against the edge of the oak table. He brought his face closer to Diane. He listed her betrayals line by line. He condemned her for treating me like an unlimited bank account while mocking my career behind my back. He expressed profound shame over the group chat messages asking how a grown woman could find joy in bullying her own family members. Then he pointed toward the hallway. His voice cracked with heavy emotion. He told Diane she had treated an innocent boy like a stray animal. He stated that Leo had offered them nothing but respect and kindness, and in return, they had fed him scraps and assigned him to a folding chair in the dark. He told her she was a hollow, broken woman who valued the superficial appearance of a genetic bloodline over the actual content of a person's character. He told her she had poisoned the family from the inside out, and he was done pretending he did not taste the venom. I watched my mother react to the confrontation. A normal person presented with undeniable proof of their own treachery would crumble. They would apologize, express remorse, or seek forgiveness. Diane chose a different path. She possessed a narcissism so deep it defied basic human logic. She straightened her spine, gripping the edge of the table with white knuckles. She raised her chin, her eyes flashing with indignant rage. She screeched her defense across the dining room. She claimed she was the only one trying to protect the Leach heritage. She declared she had to prioritize the true bloodline above all else. She insisted the legacy farm belonged to the genetic heirs, not to some corporate holding company or an adopted outsider. She argued that the forgery was a necessary risk to ensure Natalie and her twins maintained their rightful status in the community. She showed zero remorse for the fraud, the gambling debts, or the cruelty. She only displayed an arrogant, blinding entitlement. Her response drained the remaining fight from my father. The anger faded from his posture, replaced by a profound, crushing defeat. He looked at his wife as if staring at a stranger he had never met. He realized the woman he spent his life accommodating was entirely void of empathy. He realized his complicity in her cruelty. His willingness to stay silent to avoid an argument had cost him the only daughter who ever actually supported him. He turned his head and looked at me. His eyes were bright with unshed tears. He did not issue a plea for forgiveness. He did not ask me to reconsider the eviction notice. He did not beg me to stay and fix the mess. He knew he had forfeited the right to ask for mercy the moment he let his wife pull Leo away from the vintage Mustang in the garage. He simply nodded his head, offering a silent, tragic acknowledgement of his own failure. I accepted his silence. The logistics director persona faded, replaced entirely by the instincts of a protective mother. I turned away from the ruined holiday feast, the forged documents, and the weeping relatives. I knelt down on the hardwood floor until I was face to face with my son. I placed both of my hands on his small shoulders. I looked directly into his brown eyes. I spoke with a voice full of warmth and unwavering certainty. I told him he did nothing wrong. I told him his heart was good and his presence was a gift. I assured him that the cruelty in this house belonged to them, not to him. I wiped the single tear from his cheek with my thumb. I told him he was my true family, and that was the only bond that mattered. I told him we were leaving this house, and we were never coming back to sit in their shadows. Leo nodded. A small, genuine smile touched the corners of his mouth. The heavy burden of trying to win their impossible approval lifted from his shoulders. He let out a long breath, standing taller. I stood up. I gripped his hand tight in mine. I did not look back at the dining room. I did not say goodbye to the aunts, the cousins, the weeping sister, or the hyperventilating mother. I walked past the floral sofa and through the foyer. I reached for the heavy brass handle of the front door. I pulled it open, stepping out onto the wooden porch. The crisp Indiana evening air hit our faces, carrying the sharp, clean scent of approaching snow. It was a stark, refreshing contrast to the suffocating heat of the farmhouse. The porch lights illuminated the gravel driveway leading toward the county highway. We walked down the wooden steps together. The heavy front door clicked shut behind us, severing the connection permanently, leaving the toxic remnants of the Leach family to drown in the consequences of their own design. The Midwestern winter arrived with brutal efficiency. December in Indiana brings a damp, bone-chilling frost that hardens the topsoil and strips the final leaves from the oak trees. 3 weeks had passed since the Thanksgiving dinner. The administrative guillotine I dropped on the dining room table was no longer a theoretical threat. It was an active, executing force. The consequences rippled through the family structure with the precision of a collapsing supply chain. The regional commercial bank did not treat a forged quitclaim deed as a simple family misunderstanding. Financial institutions employed dedicated fraud departments to mitigate risk. When my attorney provided the underwriter with the certified proof of my exclusive ownership, the lender initiated a formal internal review. That review quickly escalated into a criminal referral. Detectives from the local precinct visited Brent at his leased storefront office on a Tuesday morning. They asked pointed questions regarding the unauthorized collateral pledge and the blue notary stamp. Furthermore, the offshore sports betting syndicates do not offer grace periods. Without the infusion of stolen equity, his gambling debts defaulted. His creditors began making persistent, intimidating phone calls to his personal residence. Within a fortnight, the State Real Estate Commission suspended his brokerage license pending a formal hearing. The glossy billboards featuring his confident smirk were quietly dismantled along the highway. His entire professional identity evaporated, leaving behind nothing but an insurmountable mountain of liabilities. My sister Natalie experienced the catastrophic decompression of her fabricated suburban reality. Her country club membership was revoked due to insufficient funds. The leased German sedan was repossessed from her driveway under the cover of darkness. She spent her adult life mocking my career and relying on her husband to project affluence. Now she faced the terrifying prospect of actual poverty. One evening, my cellular phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. A lengthy text message illuminated the screen. It was from Natalie. The tone lacked her usual condescension. It was a desperate, rambling plea for financial assistance. She begged for a short-term loan to cover the upcoming private school tuition for her twins. She attempted to use Mason and Harper as leverage, asking how I could let my nephew and niece suffer the humiliation of transferring to a public district mid-year. I read the message once. I did not type a response. I did not offer advice. I simply pressed the delete button, erasing her digital presence from my device. The account was permanently closed. Back at the 50-acre estate, the 30-day eviction clock marched steadily toward zero. Diane initially attempted to ignore the legal notice, assuming she could manipulate her way out of the consequence. When the utility shutoffs took effect, the reality of her predicament solidified. The farmhouse grew freezing cold without the propane heating service. The faucets ran dry. She realized I was not negotiating. They were forced to procure moving boxes and pack their belongings under the harsh glare of battery-powered lanterns. The most profound symbol of their departure occurred on a bitter Thursday morning. I drove past the property perimeter to verify their compliance with the eviction order. I parked my sedan on the shoulder of the county road and watched the extraction from a distance. A heavy-duty flatbed towing vehicle was backed up to the detached barn. My father Richard stood in the freezing wind, watching as the operator winched the pristine 1969 Ford Mustang onto the metal ramp. The vintage muscle car, the precious heirloom Diane had promised to the biological grandson, was being hauled away to a rented storage unit. Richard kept his hands jammed deep into his coat pockets. His shoulders sagged under the weight of his passive failures. The vehicle disappeared down the gravel path, marking the official end of their mechanical legacy. In a rural community, information travels faster than a winter storm. Rumors circulated through the local diners and church congregations. Diane attempted to control the narrative. She visited the local coffee shops, painting herself as a tragic victim. She spun a fabricated tale about a heartless corporate daughter casting her elderly parents out into the snow over a minor disagreement. She expected the town to rally around her perceived martyrdom. I did not engage in a public shouting match. I utilized a much more effective strategy. I relied on the undeniable transparency of the county records system. The initial foreclosure documents from 5 years prior the blind trust purchased the forged quitclaim deed and the police reports regarding Brent were all matters of public record. Inquisitive neighbors and gossiping acquaintances eventually sought out the actual paperwork. When the community read the certified facts, Diane lost her remaining social currency. Her friends stopped returning her phone calls. The polite smiles at the grocery store transformed into icy stares of judgment. She was exposed, not as a wealthy matriarch, but as a fraudulent tenant who had attempted to steal from her own child. With the property finally vacant, I faced a significant logistical decision. The average real estate investor would list the 50-acre parcel on the open market, sell the fertile soil to a residential developer, and walk away with a substantial profit. That path offered financial gain, but it lacked a certain moral symmetry. I required a resolution that would serve as a permanent physical reminder of their failed betrayal. I examined the municipal zoning regulations governing that specific township corridor. The land sat adjacent to a major state highway, rendering it eligible for commercial and industrial rezoning. My corporation was actively seeking a location for a new regional distribution hub. The supply chain required a modernized facility to manage the increased flow of automotive components. I presented a comprehensive proposal to my executive board. I offered to lease the 50-acre parcel to the company under a long-term, highly favorable commercial contract. The board approved the initiative unanimously. Within days, heavy construction machinery arrived at the former Leach estate. The excavators tore down the old wooden fencing. The bulldozers flattened the agricultural fields where my grandfather used to plant corn. The quaint, picturesque farmhouse was systematically dismantled to make way for a vast foundation of poured concrete. Over the subsequent months, a sleek, state-of-the-art commercial warehouse rose from the dirt. The structure featured polished steel siding, rows of elevated loading docks, and a pristine asphalt parking lot. It was a monument to efficiency and corporate progress, erected directly on top of the ashes of their precious bloodline legacy. The poetic justice of this development crystallized in the daily routine of my mother. Following the eviction, Diane and Richard could only afford to secure a cramped 2-bedroom rental apartment in a lower-income neighborhood 2 towns over. The location of their new modest dwelling required Diane to travel down that exact state highway every time she drove to the local supermarket. To ensure the message was unmistakable, I authorized the installation of a towering illuminated corporate sign near the entrance of the new distribution facility. The sprawling display featured our company logo and my specific departmental division in stark, glowing letters. Every single day, Diane is forced to navigate her aging vehicle past the sweeping commercial complex. She must look at the gleaming steel warehouse. She must read the name of the corporation her daughter directs. She is constantly reminded that the generational wealth she tried to steal through forgery was transformed into a concrete empire she can never access. The invisible bank was replaced by a fortress. The physical removal of my mother and sister from my daily operations brought a profound sense of operational stability. Leo thrived in the absence of their toxic scrutiny. However, a severed supply chain occasionally experiences unpredictable aftershocks. While Diane and Natalie were permanently exiled to their respective ruins, the patriarch of the family remained an unresolved variable. Richard had lost his home, his vintage car, and his reputation. He had stayed silent for decades, but the crushing weight of his new reality was beginning to force a structural change in his behavior. I assumed the eviction marked the final interaction with my parents. I was incorrect. A new variable was about to walk directly into my corporate lobby, carrying the heavy burden of a delayed reckoning. The corporate headquarters of my logistics firm operates on a foundation of predictable efficiency. Security protocols require guests to schedule appointments 48 hours in advance. Visitors must scan a digital barcode at the turnstile before accessing the glass elevators. I appreciate this rigid structure. It eliminates unexpected variables. Human desperation rarely adheres to visitor protocols. On a Tuesday morning in late January, my desk console chimed. The lobby receptionist informed me a man claiming to be my father was standing near the security desk. He did not possess an appointment. He refused to leave the premises. I instructed the receptionist to hold him in the waiting area. I saved my spreadsheets, straightened my blazer, and rode the elevator down to the ground floor. The lobby is a sterile expanse of white marble and chrome. Richard sat on a geometric leather bench. He looked remarkably out of place among the rushing executives and digital stock tickers. The Midwestern winter had aged him. He wore a faded canvas jacket and held a worn baseball cap tightly between his calloused hands. He had always used physical labor to mask his emotional cowardice, but he possessed no tools to hide behind today. I sat on the opposite end of the leather bench. I did not offer a warm greeting. I waited for him to state his objective. Richard looked at the polished marble floor. He cleared his throat. He informed me he no longer lived in the cramped rental apartment with my mother. The crushing weight of their financial ruin and the exposure of her criminal fraud had fractured their marital foundation. He packed a single suitcase and moved into a modest two-bedroom unit on the industrial side of a neighboring town. He was alone. He did not offer this information to elicit pity. He presented it as a statement of fact. Then he delivered an apology. He did not ask for forgiveness regarding the forged commercial loan. He acknowledged his ignorance of the crime was a direct result of his willful blindness. He apologized for 34 years of cowardly silence. He used a mechanical analogy, comparing his marriage to an engine with a critical structural flaw. He admitted he heard the knocking in the pistons for decades, but chose to turn up the radio rather than fix the broken components. His voice cracked. He looked up from the marble floor and met my gaze. He spoke about Thanksgiving. He recounted the image of Leo standing in the hallway holding a useless plastic gift card, absorbing the vicious words of a woman who despised him. Richard confessed his silence in that moment was the greatest failure of his life. He recognized that keeping the peace with a toxic spouse required sacrificing the innocent people he was supposed to protect. He wrung the fabric of his baseball cap. He stated he understood the eviction. He respected the permanent boundary I erected between my household and the rest of the Leach family. He did not ask me to attend family reunions. He did not request holiday invitations. He presented a single, highly specific petition. He asked if he could maintain a relationship with his grandson. I evaluated his request through the lens of risk assessment. Reintroducing a compromised element into a secure supply chain carries inherent danger. If I allowed Richard access to Leo, I risked creating a backdoor conduit for my mother or my sister to resume their emotional sabotage. A logistics director must also weigh the cost of a total embargo. Leo possessed a genuine affinity for his grandfather. The boy loved discussing classic automobiles and engine specifications. Severing that bond entirely would inflict an unnecessary casualty on my son. I established the parameters of a highly probationary contract. I spoke in clear, unambiguous terms. I told Richard he could see Leo, but the interactions would operate under strict regulatory compliance. Diane was permanently exiled. Natalie was banned. Brent was erased. If Richard ever allowed any of those three individuals within 100 yards of my son, the contract would terminate instantly and permanently. I outlined the scheduling constraints. There would be no shared Thanksgiving dinners. We would not attend Christmas mornings or summer barbecues. The traditional calendar of Midwestern family gatherings was nullified. Their meetings would occur on neutral ground. I authorized weekend visits to local automotive shows and Saturday morning breakfasts at public diners. I maintained full veto power over any proposed activity. Richard listened to the stringent conditions. A lesser man might have argued the severity of the rules. He might have complained about the lack of trust. Richard simply bowed his head. He accepted the heavy terms without a fraction of hesitation. A single tear escaped his eye, rolling down his weathered cheek to land on the canvas fabric of his jacket. He wept quietly in that sterile corporate lobby. The tears were born from the crushing realization that his passive complicity had cost him the unrestricted joy of his true family. He thanked me. He stood up, placed his cap on his head, and walked out the rotating glass doors into the freezing city air. I returned to my office and resumed my daily operations. The protocol was established. We executed the first trial phase of the agreement later that week. On a Saturday morning, Richard arrived at a classic chrome diner situated halfway between my secure residence and his new apartment. I parked my sedan in the lot and walked Leo inside. The establishment smelled of frying bacon and dark roasted coffee. Richard sat in a red vinyl booth near the back window. He stood up immediately when we approached the table. He did not pat Leo on the head or offer a condescending greeting. He extended his calloused right hand. He treated the 9-year-old boy with the profound, undeniable respect of an equal. Leo smiled his bright, resilient smile and shook his grandfather's hand. I slid into the booth opposite them. I ordered a black coffee and opened a logistics report on my digital tablet, serving as the silent auditor of their interaction. Richard produced a stack of vintage automotive magazines from his coat pocket. He slid them across the Formica table. The two of them spent the next hour dissecting the horsepower specifications of classic muscle cars. Richard listened intently to every word my son spoke. He did not interrupt. He did not change the subject to appease an invisible hierarchy. The toxic ghost of my mother was notably absent from the booth. The environment was safe, regulated, and healthy. The waitress brought plates of pancakes and scrambled eggs. Richard made sure Leo received the maple syrup first. It was a minor gesture, but it represented a monumental shift in priority. For the first time in his life, my father was actively placing the needs of his adopted grandson above his own comfort. He asked Leo questions about his school projects and his favorite subjects. He engaged with the reality of the child sitting in front of him, rather than mourning the genetic fantasy Diane had tried to enforce. I monitored the breakfast meeting closely. I watched for any sign of manipulation or hidden agendas. I found none. Richard was a broken man attempting to rebuild a single sturdy bridge out of the wreckage he helped create. He adhered to the parameters of the contract flawlessly. He did not mention Diane. He did not bring up the lost farmhouse or the fraudulent loan. He focused entirely on the present moment. When the meal concluded, Richard paid the bill. We walked out to the parking lot together. He knelt down to eye level with Leo, shook his hand once more, and promised to bring a specific catalog of engine parts to their next meeting. Leo climbed into my vehicle, his face glowing with quiet satisfaction. The probationary contract was functioning smoothly. We survived the winter months utilizing this controlled framework. The snow melted, giving way to the humid warmth of an Indiana spring. The month of May approached, bringing the roar of the racing season. The ultimate test of our new family structure was waiting at the historic oval track, where a fresh tradition was ready to replace the ashes of the old legacy. May arrives in Indiana with a sudden humid heat that washes away the bitter frost of the winter months. The frozen cornfields transform into vibrant green grids. In our section of the Midwestern heartland, the 5th month of the calendar belongs entirely to the racing season. The Indianapolis Motor Speedway acts as the cultural epicenter of the state. It is a sprawling cathedral constructed of concrete, steel, and asphalt. The atmosphere smells of high-octane aviation fuel, melted synthetic rubber, and the distinct metallic tang of hot exhaust. The air vibrates with the deafening roar of combustion engines, pushing the absolute limits of mechanical physics. We arrived at the perimeter security gates early on a Friday morning. I handed our printed credentials to the attendant standing near the chain link fence. These were the specific premium access vouchers I purchased on that cold Monday in November, just hours before I systematically dismantled my family's financial architecture. I had promised my son a golden ticket to his mechanical dreams to shield him from the impending holiday fallout. I intended to deliver on that promise. The security guard scanned the barcodes and waved us through the checkpoint. We stepped onto the polished concrete floor of the VIP garage sector. Leo absorbed the environment with wide, silent awe. He wore a clean polo shirt and a brand new racing cap with a flat brim. He held a silver permanent marker tightly in his right hand. We walked past the gleaming aerodynamic chassis of the open-wheel cars resting on elevated hydraulic jacks. We watched the pit crews orchestrating their morning preparations. A professional pit stop is the ultimate display of supply chain logistics. Every mechanic executes their assigned duty with flawless, practiced rhythm. Any defective component is immediately identified, extracted, and discarded without a second thought. The team does not negotiate with broken parts. There is a profound lesson hidden within that mechanical ruthlessness. As we navigated the bustling garage, my mind briefly drifted back to the town parade incident from the previous autumn. Diane had fabricated a lie about municipal insurance regulations to keep Leo off a rusty agricultural flatbed trailer. She orchestrated that exclusion because she wanted to project a pure genetic bloodline to a crowd of local spectators. Now my son was standing inside the most exclusive automotive sanctuary in the world, surrounded by millions of dollars of cutting-edge technology. He did not need her fake heritage. We forged our own authentic tradition. The toxic branches of the Leach family tree remained permanently pruned. The criminal investigation into the forged commercial loan application proceeded steadily through the county prosecutor division. Brent secured a defense attorney, draining whatever liquid capital Natalie had left in her checking account. Their prestigious country club lifestyle was replaced by a relentless barrage of legal summons and aggressive creditor notices. The glossy facade of their suburban perfection shattered, leaving behind a frantic scramble for basic survival. Diane remained trapped in her modest rental unit. Her daily commute required her to drive past the imposing commercial distribution center bearing my corporate logo, constructed directly upon the soil she tried to steal. They all learned a severe, unforgiving lesson about leverage. DNA does not function as a valid currency. Shared genetic material does not grant anyone a lifetime line of credit, nor does it excuse felony wire fraud. We approached the designated meet and greet sector located near the central hauler alley. A prominent driver emerged from his team transport vehicle. He wore a fire-retardant suit covered in embroidered sponsor patches. He did not rush past the waiting fans to seek shelter in his private lounge. He walked directly toward the velvet stanchion where Leo was standing. My son held out his blank racing cap. The driver knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with the 9-year-old boy. They spent 3 minutes discussing aerodynamic downforce, tire degradation, and track temperatures. The professional athlete treated Leo with profound, unyielding respect. He engaged the boy's intellect rather than dismissing his youth. He listened to my son's questions and provided detailed, thoughtful answers. The driver uncapped the silver marker and signed his name across the brim of the hat. He handed the garment back, offered a firm handshake, and returned to his vehicle to prepare for the practice session. Leo placed the signed cap on his head. He turned to face me. The smile radiating across his features possessed a brilliant, untethered joy. It was a stark departure from the hesitant, guarded expressions he constantly wore inside the farmhouse. The heavy, suffocating shadow of my mother's relentless judgment was gone. He was finally free to thrive in the bright sunlight. Standing on that polished concrete floor, listening to the whine of pneumatic drills echoing off the grandstands, I reevaluated the core concept of Midwestern values. For decades, our rural communities celebrated a distorted version of stoicism. We were taught that strength meant swallowing abuse, ignoring insults, and keeping the peace, regardless of the personal cost. We were instructed to bury our domestic dysfunction under layers of polite smiles and holiday casseroles. That is not strength. That is cowardice, disguised as heritage. True stoicism requires cold, calculated courage. It is the ability to look at a decaying structure and make the difficult choice to tear it down to the foundation. It is the willingness to audit your own life, identify the toxic rot spreading through the floorboards, and surgically extract the infected wood. You do not fix a compromised load-bearing wall by applying another coat of paint. You fix it by grabbing a sledgehammer. I protected my son by becoming the ruthless architect of our own boundaries. Family is not a biological default. You do not inherit a tribe simply by sharing a last name or a set of facial features. Family is an active, daily choice. It is a structure built through mutual respect, unwavering protection, and the courage to set a chair at the table for those who truly belong. Diane and Natalie believed blood granted them an infinite license to inflict pain. They discovered the hard way that the invisible bank always calls the debt eventually. The engines fired up for the afternoon practice runs. The noise was deafening, drowning out any lingering thoughts of the past. The ground beneath our feet vibrated with raw power. I put my hand on my son's shoulder. We walked toward the viewing platform to watch the machines push the boundaries of speed. We had a long, bright summer ahead of us, unburdened by the expectations of people who never valued our presence. That is my story. A missing basketball jersey, a forged quitclaim deed, and a Thanksgiving dinner that ended an empire of lies. If someone in your life treats your generosity as an unlimited resource or mistakes your quiet endurance for weakness, consider this your formal sign to audit the ledger. Do not wait for them to change. Do not negotiate with people who view your boundaries as a challenge. Gather your receipts, pack your briefcase, and close the account permanently. Share this story with anyone who needs the courage to walk away from a toxic table. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.